Works for me.
Yeah. Thank you, Barb. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to our last day of the 23rd Annual New Mexico Data Users Conference. Our speaker today is Michael Hawes, and he's going to be talking about the way the Census Bureau protects our data, but also about how that impacts the usability of the data. So those of you who are data users are going to be interested in what that might mean for your research. When I first heard that the Census Bureau was changing the way they were going to protect people's data, I invited Michael Hawes, I think probably the very first year you were presenting on differential privacy. So I know he's been a consistent presenter here at the Data Users Conference last 3 years, or has it been 4?
So, yeah, since 2019, yes.
Yeah. So 2 years in virtually and 1 year in person. So hopefully next year we can have you back again, so you can be back in person. So let me have Michael Hawes speak on differential privacy. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And Susan, can you just confirm that you can see my slides?
Yes, we can see your slides.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for having me today. It's always a pleasure to speak with you all. So as Susan mentioned, I am going to explain our new 2020 Census Disclosure Avoidance System, which is the new methodology that we're using to protect the confidentiality of our respondents' data in our 2020 Census data publications. I'll also get into a little bit about why we're making the change and what some of the implications are. Before I get started, I just want to thank all my colleagues here at the Census Bureau who have contributed to the information that's contained in today's presentation. I want to thank all of our stakeholders who have provided invaluable feedback and input into the decision-making that we've had. And then also just say that any opinions or viewpoints I express today are entirely my own. So the Census Bureau's mission is to be the nation's leading provider of high-quality statistics about the country's people and economy. And central to our ability to fulfill that mission is our ability to protect the privacy of our respondents and the confidentiality of their data. Now, this is a legal requirement for us under Title 13, Sections 8B and 9, but it really underpins our ability to collect quality data in the first place. If we weren't able to convince the American public that we're able to protect their data, then many respondents would not be willing to give us their personal information in the first place. So we have to be able to guarantee that we can adequately protect the data when we're publishing it in order to collect those data in the first place. So this really is central to our mission. Now, over the past century, the Census Bureau has been a world leader in the research, design, and implementation of a whole family of statistical techniques known variably as disclosure avoidance or statistical disclosure limitation. These statistical techniques are used to protect confidentiality in data that you want to release publicly. And over the years, as we've increased the amount of data that we've been publishing, and as privacy threats have emerged and grown, we've had to modify, updates, and innovate those statistical techniques in order to keep pace with those changes. Our adoption of differential privacy for the 2020 census is really just like the latest in what has been a long history of continuous innovation in this space. So what is the fundamental challenge that we're trying to address? Well, at the end of the day, any time that you're going to release any statistic, any piece of information that's calculated or derived from a confidential data source, releasing that statistic or data product, data table, piece of information, however you want to consider it, releasing that is going to reveal or leak a tiny bit of confidential information in the process. And what this means is that if you release too many statistics too accurately, well, then eventually all of those together will reveal the entire underlying confidential data in the process. And this challenge is even harder in the context of some recent developments that have occurred. There's been a massive proliferation of third-party data that can be used to try to pick out specific individuals in the data products that we, the Census Bureau, publish. And parallel to this growth in third-party data that could be used in an attack is the fact that computers and machine learning algorithms have gotten much more powerful and efficient over the last several years. So today's computers can easily perform the complex large-scale calculations and database manipulations that would be necessary to leverage all of that third-party data in an attack on the data products that we publish. And these aren't abstract threat. These are real concrete concerns that we have to be able to address. So historically, kind of one of the biggest approaches that statistical agencies and other organizations have taken is they've been trying to protect against what are known as reidentification attacks. And these have traditionally been focused on microdata releases, data products where you're releasing individual level records for the data subjects in your confidential data. And traditional approaches to confidentiality protection will apply some form of disclosure avoidance on those data, usually removing direct identifiers from those individual level records and publishing quote unquote anonymized versions of those individual level records. But unfortunately, a reidentification attack essentially is able to reattach individuals' names and direct identifiers to those quote unquote anonymized data. And they do this by essentially relying on what you can think of as like pseudo identifiers or indirect identifiers. In this particular example here, imagine you had a published data set that included no names, but included things like an individual's block location, their age, and their sex. Well, using location, age, and sex, you could link those individual level records to some third-party data source, some publicly available data like voter registration lists or a commercial data file that also contains individuals' location, age, and sex. And then you're able to reattach individuals' names to those records. And so an attacker here performing this kind of re-identification would be able to learn Jane, Joe, and John's race and relationship status by doing this kind of re-identification. So as I mentioned a moment ago, a lot of kind of traditional disclosure avoidance approaches really focused their efforts on protecting microdata, those individual level records that would be released. Think the public use microdata samples, PUMS files. And disclosure avoidance for aggregate tabular data was usually kind of significantly less stringent in that regard. And there's been this misperception that aggregation of data is often enough to actually protect the confidentiality of data subjects that are reflected in those aggregate data. Well, unfortunately, this really isn't the case anymore. There is another kind of form of privacy attack that could be performed that reconstructs individual level records from aggregate tabular data that are released. And you could think of this kind of like a giant game of Sudoku, if you're familiar with Sudoku puzzles. If you're playing a Sudoku puzzle, if there's enough numbers like pre-populated into the puzzle grid, well, there's going to be one and only one solution to the puzzle. Well, the same holds true with aggregate data tables. If you publish enough tables from the same company, well, then eventually there's going to be one and only one set of individual level records that could have yielded all of those aggregate tabular data releases. And computers can actually solve for those individual level records from the aggregated data with relative ease today. And so this becomes a new vector of attack against aggregate data releases that needs to be defended against. So with this kind of threat of reconstruction attacks in mind, the Census Bureau wanted to see, okay, just how effective were the confidentiality protections that we used for the 2010 census? How effective were they at protecting against this kind of reconstruction-based attack? So to give you a little bit of context, the 2010 census collected a handful of attributes, including location, age, sex, race, ethnicity, and relationship status, for the approximately 309 million people that were enumerated in the 2010 census. And that gave us about 1.9 billion confidential data points that we had to protect. But the 2010 census data products that we publicly released included over 150 billion, with a B, different statistics that were calculated or derived from those 1.9 billion confidential data points. So remembering what I said a few moments ago, that every one of those statistics that we're publishing is going to reveal or leak a tiny bit of information in the process, we wanted to see, okay, were those 150 billion statistics sufficient to reconstruct individual level records from the 2010 census? So we decided to conduct an internal simulated attack on the published 2010 census data to see, okay, just how vulnerable were those methods that we used back then to this new kind of attack. And I will say that the results were rather alarming. In fact, using just a small portion of the data products that were publicly released after the 2010 census, we were able to reconstruct individual level records for all 309 million people in the US. And we were able to do so for their block location, their sex, their age in years, plus or minus 1 year, their race to the OMB 63 race categories, and their ethnicity for 71% of the US population, or about 219 million people. And then linking those individual level records that we reconstructed to commercially available data from the time period using location, age, and sex as those linking variables. We were able to reattach names to those records, and then comparing those names, looking to see, did we get it right? We were able to confirm that we had correctly determined the name, location, age, sex, race, and ethnicity of 52 million people, or 17% of the entire US population. And this was really an eye-opener. This really served to show that the confidentiality protections that we've been using for the aggregate tabular summaries from the 2010 census were no longer sufficient to meet these new kinds of attacks. So Census Bureau decided we had to modernize our approach to confidentiality protection, that we had to improve the techniques that we're using to protect confidentiality, particularly in the aggregate tabular summaries that we were releasing from the census. So in order to meet our continuing obligations to safeguard respondent privacy, we had to make a change in those disclosure avoidance methods. Now, to understand why we made the shift to differential privacy as our approach, it's helpful to understand a little bit about how disclosure avoidance methods work in the first place. So again, disclosure avoidance methods are those statistical safeguards that you can use to protect confidentiality in publicly released data. Now, disclosure avoidance methods seek to make re-identification attacks more difficult by doing one or more of three basic things. They seek to either reduce the precision of the data that you're publishing. They can remove vulnerable records, those individuals most at risk of re-identification from the data that you're going to publish. Or they can add some uncertainty or noise into the data that you're publishing. And by doing one or more of those three, you can make re-identification less likely, or you can decrease an attacker's confidence that they've correctly re-identified individuals in your public data. And now commonly used kind of historical techniques for performing disclosure avoidance include things that you've probably seen in census data or in other agencies' data over the years. Things like complementary suppression, where you remove cells from your data tables, particularly for your smallest cells. Rounding, where you're not reporting actual numbers but rounded numbers to varying degrees of precision or coarseness. Recoding extreme values at the top or bottom ends of your distribution. So, for example, not reporting that an individual was 102 years old, just saying that they're over 90. Sampling, only releasing a sample of records from a larger population, like a PUMS file, for example. Record swapping, like we used for the 2010 censuses, where you're actually swapping individual records from one geography to another. Or other forms of noise injection, where you're introducing uncertainty into the resulting data. Well, the problem that all of these statistical techniques have is that fundamentally any statistical technique that you're going to use to protect privacy is going to impose a fundamental trade-off between the degree of privacy protection on the one hand and the resulting accuracy or availability of the data on the other. And this is not a side effect of the confidentiality protections. It's actually how they do their job. You are able to protect privacy by reducing accuracy. And how you navigate that balance between the strength of the privacy protection on the one hand and the relative accuracy of the data on the other is determined by the parameters of your disclosure avoidance methods implementation. So it could be things like what kind of swapping rates are you using? What percentage of records are you going to be swapping? Or other noise injection parameters. What thresholds will you use to determine which cells you need to suppress in the published tables? All of those are what determine this trade-off. But for traditional disclosure avoidance methods, there's really not much in the way of an ability to quantify the privacy risk or the degree of privacy protection. Most of these methods rely on kind of expert judgment or kind of subjective assessment of how strong they're being implemented. So when faced with like kind of evidence of rising disclosure risk, rising privacy concerns, practitioners of kind of traditional disclosure avoidance methods have known that they needed to change their parameters, like increase the parameters, the stringentness of those privacy protections, but this was a very scattershot solution. They had no way of quantifying how much was enough. And this kind of ad hoc and scattershot approach often meant that you're overprotecting some of the data that you're releasing, essentially making it less accurate than it needs to be for the same degree of privacy protection, while simultaneously underprotecting some of the most vulnerable records in the data that you're releasing. So that brings us to differential privacy. Now, differential privacy is not a disclosure avoidance method per se, the same way that like swapping or cell suppression is a disclosure avoidance method. Rather, differential privacy is best thought of as like a privacy risk accounting framework. And this accounting framework allows you to define and then quantify the degree of privacy risk, or conversely, the degree of privacy protection in the resulting data. Every data subject, every individual that's reflected in a particular statistic that you publish contributes towards that statistic's value. And every statistic that you publish, as I mentioned before, is going to reveal or leak a tiny bit of confidential information in the process. So this privacy risk accounting framework of differential privacy allows you to assess each individual's contribution to each of the statistics you want to release. And to measure, and by correlation, then limit how much information about that individual is going to be revealed in each statistic that you publish. So when you combine this kind of privacy risk accounting framework of differential privacy with an actual disclosure avoidance technique like noise injection, where you're injecting noise or error into the statistics that you're publishing, differential privacy allows you to very precisely control the amount of confidential information leakage in the statistics that you want to publish. And now this approach offers a number of really significant advantages over kind of traditional approaches to disclosure avoidance. For starters, and as we'll see in a couple minutes, it's infinitely tunable. The parameters of your noise injection can be thought of as like dials, and they can be set anywhere on that spectrum, from perfect privacy with useless data at the one extreme to perfect data with no privacy protections at all at the other extreme, or somewhere in between. Perhaps more importantly, from kind of the disclosure risk standpoint, the privacy guarantee offered by this accounting framework is mathematically provable and it's future proof. So you don't have to worry about what new third-party data could be used in an attack or what advancements in machine learning algorithms are going to happen next week, next month, next year that could open up new vectors of attack on the data that you publish. And lastly, this precise calibration and this quantification of risk and protection here enables optimal data accuracy for any given level of privacy protection. So there's a number of really significant advantages that differential privacy gives us when compared with kind of traditional approaches to disclosure avoidance that lacked this ability to quantify risk and protection. So to understand what all this means for the 2020 census, it's helpful to understand kind of what all the data products for the 2020 census are and how they're clustered. So here is kind of an informal grouping of the 2020 census data products into kind of three buckets. And internally at the Census Bureau, we often refer to these as kind of the group 1 data products, the group 2 data products, and the group 3 data products. And those aren't their official names, but it's helpful to think of them in these kind of three buckets. So this first group includes the Public Law 94-171 Redistricting Data Summary file, which we released back in August of this year. It also includes the demographic profiles and the demographic and housing characteristics files. The second bucket of data products include the detailed products on like detailed race, detailed ethnicity, and detailed household structure. And those are called the detailed demographic and housing characteristics file. Excuse me. And then the third kind of bucket is everything else. And those are data products that are still to be determined, but may include public use microdata files, special tabulations, researcher access through the federal statistical research data centers, and other kind of out-year uses of the 2020 census. Now, these three buckets of data products are being protected all with differential privacy, but because they pose their own unique challenges in terms of amount of detail included and their intended use cases, we're actually using a variety of different differentially private algorithms to protect the underlying data in these different sets of data products. So the group 1 products are being protected using one differentially private system known as the top-down algorithm. And the top-down algorithm, or TDA, produces privacy-protected microdata that are then ingested by our decennial tabulation systems. So the output of the disclosure avoidance process for these group 1 products are individual level records that have already had privacy applied to them that can then be aggregated and tabulated however you want using kind of the standard decennial tabulation approach. And this is the method that we used for the redistricting data that we released back in August, and that we'll be using for the demographic and housing characteristics file over the coming year. The group 2 products, because of the amount of detail included in those, we took a different approach. And so the algorithms that we're using for those, also based on differential privacy, are known as SafeTab and PHSafe. And these products essentially apply the privacy protections as they're being tabulated. So the output of these algorithms is not individual level records anymore. The output of those algorithms are the privacy protected tabulations directly. So essentially it streamlines that process and allows you to be very precise in protecting just the tabulations that you want to release. And then those group 3 products can use any of these existing algorithms, the top-down algorithm, SafeTab, PHSafe, or other formally private solutions yet to be determined. So now, again, to understand kind of what all this means, it's helpful to think back to what I was discussing before about all disclosure avoidance imposes this trade-off between privacy and accuracy. As I said, this is a fundamental consequence of the privacy protection. And you can kind of envision this as a spectrum with, as I said, like perfect privacy with completely useless data at the one extreme, and perfect data, perfectly accurate data with no privacy protections at the other extreme. And your goal is to find the point in between those extremes somewhere where you have sufficient accuracy, sufficiently accurate data to meet the intended uses of your data products, while also having sufficient privacy protections to meet your legal and ethical obligations to protect your respondents. And that's a little bit of juggling there, trying to find that sweet spot. But once you've found that point where the data are sufficiently accurate and sufficiently well protected, that point on that spectrum can be known as your privacy loss budget. And much like a monetary budget, the higher your privacy loss budget, the more privacy risk you're willing to accept. The lower your privacy loss budget, the less privacy risk you're willing to accept, and the lower the resulting accuracy of your data. And you'll see this privacy loss budget abbreviated in different ways in different contexts, either as the acronym PLB or by the Greek letters epsilon or rho. Once you've determined that privacy loss budget for the data that you want to protect, you can then allocate that privacy loss budget into shares. And the higher the share that you allocate to any particular data product, the greater the relative accuracy of those data. So for example, for the Group 1 products, we have already allocated privacy loss budget to the redistricting data that we released back in August. We'll be allocating additional privacy loss budget to the demographic and housing characteristics file next year. There will be additional privacy loss budget allocated to the detailed DHC, those detailed race and ethnicity and household composition data. And then additional privacy loss budget will be allocated to all of those subsequent uses of census data. And all of those add together and become your global privacy loss budget, that global sweet spot on that continuum from perfect privacy to perfect accuracy. But then even within each of your data products, you then can allocate shares of that privacy loss budget to all of the tabulations or calculations that you need to perform to produce that data product. And the higher the share of privacy loss budget allocated to any particular tabulation, the greater its relative accuracy. The lower the share of privacy loss budget allocated to it, the greater the privacy protection, but the lower the resulting accuracy. And so what you'll see here is these are the allocations of privacy loss budget that we made for the redistricting data file that we released over the summer. And what you can see here are the kind of the fractional shares of privacy loss budget, here denoted in rho, the Greek letter rho, for tabulations at different geographic levels. So how much privacy loss budget went to tabulations at the US level versus the state level versus the county level and so on. And that's in the table on the left. And then on the table on the right, you can see, okay, within each of those geographic levels, how much privacy loss budget was allocated to counts of total population versus counts by the 63 race groups. Versus farther down, counts of Hispanic or not Hispanic by those 63 race categories. Or at the very bottom, how much of the privacy loss budget was allocated to counts of all of the variables crossed with each other. So what type of household or group quarters you were in by voting age, not voting age, by Hispanic, not Hispanic, by those 63 race categories. And so within each of these, at each of the different geographic levels, you have a share of that privacy loss budget. And this is essentially those dials that I was talking about before. You can tune this to optimize accuracy for any of the statistics that you consider to be kind of the priority, feeding into the priority use cases. The more privacy loss budget you assign to particular tabulations here, the greater the relative accuracy and the better they'll be able to meet particular use cases. The lower the share, the more noise is getting inserted into them. And so there's a lot of decision making that has to be made about, okay, what is the optimal kind of setting of these dials? What is the optimal allocation of privacy loss budget across all of these different tabulations? And those decisions, setting those parameters, were informed through extensive engagement with our data users over the last couple of years. So since 2019, the Census Bureau has released 6 sets of demonstration data that were generated by running 2010 census data through our 2020 census disclosure avoidance systems top-down algorithm. And what this did was these demonstration data then allowed our data users to compare the differentially private versions of the 2010 census with different settings of all of those parameters and dials, to compare those differentially private versions of the 2010 census to the published version of the 2010 census that was protected using the old swapping routines. Now, I do want to stress in that these comparisons were not the differentially private versions to the ground truth, the enumerated values. The 2010 census data as published had noise injected into them through these swapping arrangements. So there was going to be some confusion in terms of like those comparisons because of the noise that was present already in the published 2010 data. But for the most part, this was a really effective way for data users to look at the differentially private versions of the 2010 data and see, okay, with these particular parameter settings, will it meet our use cases and so on. And so we received substantial feedback from these demonstration data products. And those feedback and analyses that we received were invaluable in helping us to tune and adjust our algorithms and those parameter settings, those allocations of privacy loss budget, to ensure that when we actually released the redistricting data back in August, that we were confident that the resulting data would meet our data users' needs. Now, based on that experience, we are going to continue and improve upon that stakeholder engagement process for now the current and ongoing tuning and optimization of the algorithm for our demographic and housing characteristics file. So we're building upon the engagement plan that we had and used for the redistricting data and expanding on it. And this will include engagement and education, feedback and listening, and additional demonstration data products. And we're promising our data users at least 2 rounds of demonstration data releases for evaluation and feedback on the DHC file, with sufficient time after each of those demonstration data releases for data users to do their analyses and provide feedback to us. We're also going to be continuing our external engagements with our advisory and stakeholder groups, including many of those listed here. I do want to point out I've found the engagement with the State Data Center Network and the CIC network has been enormously helpful, and we've gotten some wonderful feedback from you and your peers in other states. And so I do hope that you will provide that kind of feedback to us on the next sets of demonstration data. And then throughout this process, we'll also be kind of at each stage kind of reevaluating our timeline and stakeholder communication objectives. So here's our notional timeline for the development of the demographic and housing characteristics file and the optimization and tuning of the algorithm for DHC production. So this fall, we released an updated version of our 2020 Census Data Products Crosswalk file. I hope those of you saw that are listening today saw that crosswalk and were able to provide feedback on it. This essentially shows like the proposed set of tables at each level of geography and degree of detail for the 2020 census compared to what was released in 2010, to make sure that the current suite of proposed tables includes those that you need for your own uses of census data. So we received feedback on those, and that's still under evaluation, and will inform the final set of tables to be included in the DHC. This winter, we're going to be releasing our first set of demonstration data for the DHC, and then collecting feedback on it, fitness for use assessments from our stakeholders. We will then assess that feedback, do additional tuning and optimization of the algorithms for that. And then we'll, again, reassess our timeline and communicate the status of that. In the spring of 2022, we'll release the second set of demonstration data. We're going to conduct another public workshop similar to the one that we did with the Committee on National Statistics back in December of 2019. Again, we'll collect additional feedback on the second set of demonstration data and the fitness for use assessments of our data users on those demonstration data. And that information, that feedback, will then feed into our Data Stewardship Executive Policy Committee's final decisions on the parameters to be used for the actual production run of the demographic and housing characteristics file in summer of 2022. Here's just a graphical representation of that same notional timeline that I just walked through. You'll notice in particular kind of the big decision-making points, privacy loss budget decisions for the first demonstration data, the second demonstration data, and the final production runs, the release of the demonstration data products in winter of 2022 and spring of 2022, and the feedback periods along the way. If you'd like to stay informed of our developments in terms of implementing differential privacy for the 2020 census, I highly recommend subscribing to our newsletter if you haven't already. You can do that just by going to our website and searching disclosure avoidance. It's a great way to kind of stay up to date on all the latest developments. And those of you who have subscribed to our newsletter probably saw this. It came out just a few weeks ago. We did just release, in partnership with the Population Reference Bureau, a handbook on disclosure avoidance for the 2020 census, an introduction. This really goes into depth in the implementation of differential privacy for the redistricting data that we released back in August, and discusses a number of kind of considerations and implications of our implementation of the top-down algorithm for users of the redistricting data product. So I do highly recommend checking out that handbook. It's a really useful resource. And if you want additional information, definitely check out our webpage. Again, just go to census.gov and search disclosure avoidance. We have an entire recorded webinar series on an extensive set of topics relating to our implementation of DP. We've got frequently asked questions, videos, issue briefs, blog posts, you name it. There is a ton of information there. And at different levels of technical specificity. So pretty much it can answer just about any question you might have. So definitely check that out. Also, for those who want kind of a less technical introduction to differential privacy, we have a wonderful new video that came out earlier this year, done by the same people who did our communications campaign for the 2020 census. It's called Protecting Privacy in Census Bureau Statistics. That's a great little introduction to the new protections that we're using. I do highly recommend it. You can find it on our website and on our YouTube page. And with that, I am happy to stop and answer any questions that you might have.
So the first question we have in chat is the relationship between accuracy and privacy linear?
Excellent question. It is not. There are, it's definitely a curve. You can, I wish I don't have a graph for it. We actually have one of those in some of our other slide decks where you can see there's a point where you can make significant accuracy gains with very little impact on privacy risk. And then at the opposite end, you'll incur significant privacy risk with very little additional gain in accuracy. But in that middle section of it, it's okay. In short, no, it's not linear. It's a curve. I wish I had that slide with me, because it's actually a great demonstration of it. But yeah, it is a curve.
So, and I have kind of a question that I think is probably more to a data user. When I take my blocks and I sum them up, let's say I just sum up all the blocks in New Mexico because I'm insane, will I get the same total that you have published for the statewide data? And that's the first question for a data user.
Excellent question. So I can say with the redistricting data that we published in August, absolutely. So if you take the number, let's say the number of non-Hispanic blacks in every single block in New Mexico and add all of those up, you will get the state total for non-Hispanic blacks for the entire state. So everything is internally and hierarchically consistent within like the person's tables of the redistricting data. That is currently also the plan for the demographic and housing characteristics data, although we have been asked by our advisory committees to evaluate what relaxing some of those consistency requirements, what impact that might have on overall data accuracy. But the current plan is for the DHC to be similarly consistent. Subsequent data products like the detailed DHC, there's going to be some consistency issues there, but for the redistricting data, the answer is absolutely yes. Everything is horizontally and vertically consistent there.
And then Barbara has raised her hand, so go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
I was trying to be polite. Michael, can you send that slide that shows that nonlinear?
Yeah. If you give me, I'll do it afterwards. I'll
get it to Susan, and she can post it. I think the question was asking that, and I've seen that slide, and it lays it out perfectly to answer that question also. Now I will lower my hand and go back to mute.
I know nobody else has got a question, so I'll ask my next questions. I saw the release of the potential products that will be coming out, and there are a lot of tables that are not going to be there. So the good question on that is how many of the tables are being reduced?
So that is an excellent question. I do not have the number in front of me. That would be a question for our population division. They're kind of the stewards of the proposed table structures. I will say there are a number of considerations at work in the decisions on what tables to include. The most fundamental ones are, because everything's being governed by a privacy loss budget, every statistic that you're going to release consumes a share of that budget, meaning that for any particular level of privacy protection, the more statistics you want to publish, the less the resulting accuracy will be. So one of the first things that we started doing with the kind of the planning for the 2020 census was we wanted to limit ourselves to the data products and tables for which we had documented use cases, because we didn't want to be spending privacy loss budget on tables that nobody needed. And so we kind of started from scratch, and we're like, okay, how do we know that people are using census data? And we did a Federal Register notice about this, and we've been soliciting feedback from our data users to find, like, okay, what are the documented use cases for these data? And that was the purpose for doing this crosswalk too, is because I'm sure there are uses that we're not capturing. We wanted to make sure that our data users could let us know, hey, if you don't include this table, I won't be able to do this important function. Those were the kinds of things we needed to hear. The second is that, the more you publish, the greater the risk to privacy. So we were trying to find this balance where we were getting the data out that people needed without unnecessarily either increasing privacy risk or decreasing accuracy in the process. So.
Okay, so then, and I've seen what's going to be released, and just to make my data users, aware of the fact that there will be less data products coming out, and that'll be interesting. So the next question is, you're injecting noise, and we're used to, from the American Community Survey, having a margin of error. Is there going to be some way that researchers can estimate or say, this fits my 95th percentile confidence, or whatever, some way of knowing, even though it's the decennial census and 100% count, that there's some of this error in it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So before I answer how you might go about doing that, I do want to stress that there are numerous sources of error in Census Bureau statistics, in census statistics. There's coverage error, measurement error, operational error, and error resulting from disclosure avoidance. So I want to caution that focusing just on the disclosure avoidance error and looking at kind of approximate confidence intervals for that is not going to take into account these other sources of error, sometimes which are significantly larger than the disclosure avoidance error. So just with that caveat in mind, one simple way that you could do that would be, so we released for the redistricting data, for example, we released a final demonstration data product using the exact same production settings that we used to produce the official redistricting data product that we released. And so what you could do with that is comparing the production settings demonstration data to the published 2010 tabulations. You can determine like an approximate 90th percent confidence interval or 95th percent confidence interval, however, whatever degree of precision you wanted there, and look and see like, okay, for 90% of census tracts, you'll be looking at plus or minus 3 people or plus or minus 5 people for this particular statistic. And you can generate those for whatever statistic you're interested in finding that confidence interval for. It's not a true confidence interval because it's not taking into account those other sources of error or some data dependent error that isn't going to be reflected in the demonstration data. But it is an excellent way of giving you kind of an approximate margin of error there that you can use to guide your uses. We'll also, we have committed to producing additional guidance for our data users on kind of understanding fitness for use of statistics at different geographic levels. We're still working out with some of our experts in our advisory committees what form that should take, but definitely look to see that coming out later.
And then if anybody else has any good questions, I kind of knew what to ask. So, but if there's anybody else, please, feel free to unmute and ask your question. And you've been saved because I don't see any questions from Robert today.
Always happy to take Robert's questions.
And just, so our audience knows, I've been, and Robert Rodigan and I have participated in some of the meetings that Census Bureau has had around differential privacy, and certainly let our concerns be known that, in rural areas in New Mexico, the statistics are hard to start with. And so it's very hard to be worried about how is differential privacy going to impact rural communities and the statistics we get from them to start with. Well, Michael, thank you for speaking.
Wait a minute, Susan,
yes?
I want to ask a question. How is this differential privacy going to affect the reservations?
So we have been working very closely with the American Indian Alaska Native tribal leaders over the last couple of years. We've had a number, I want to say at least half a dozen formal tribal consultations and listening sessions with tribal leaders. We've been working closely with the National Congress of American Indians over that period of time because we recognize the critical importance of census data for the tribes, because this is often their only source of quality data. And so we've done a lot to ensure that the data that we're releasing for those tribal areas is of sufficient quality. And so we actually made a number of changes to the design and implementation of the top-down algorithm, specifically to address the concerns about the tribal areas. We modified the geographic hierarchy that the algorithm works along to separate out the tribal areas so that you didn't get bleeding from AIN tribal areas into non-tribal areas or vice versa. And we optimized the hierarchy within those areas to again help ensure that the tribal areas were getting good data. So this is something that we've been working closely with. And if you look at the detailed summary metrics that we released for the production settings of the redistricting data, you'll see that we were able to get the accuracy targets for those tribal areas like quite tight. So yeah.
I almost forgot to ask. It's great that Barb is here. Thank you so much for doing this for us, Michael. It really helps us understand what the data is going to be for us as we're looking at it and how to use it.
Well, it's absolutely my pleasure, and I look forward to being able to do this again next year in person. So.
In person, and we'll definitely do an El Pento run if they're still around. I think they are. They're too good not to be.
Sounds good to me, and I will provide that. I'll send you my full slide deck here, and I'll also provide that privacy accuracy curve slide. And if folks have additional questions, feel free to send them in. I'm happy to respond by email too.
So the next presentation or the next session is going to be the State Data Center affiliate meeting and workshop, and that'll start at 1 o'clock for those of you who are involved in that. We appreciate